I see we still have energy in the room, so that's very much appreciated. I'm very happy and honored to have Dakmawet Bekele and Abir Ibrahim with me. So welcome to Oxford.
Thank you.
Welcome to Said, best business school in the world.
Thank you for having us.
I'm going to start right on the top, right? We're setting a lot of grandiose ideas and plans and strategies for what is to come in the continent. We're speaking about Africa 2063. We're speaking about the Africa Free Trade Agreement. You're seeing that in Davos. You're seeing that at the African Union. How are we making sure that these things are happening at a ground level? And how do we make sure that we have the leadership that's there to actually make these things come to life?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. It's an honor and a privilege. To begin with Agenda 2063, and I believe to make sure that it's going to happen practically on the ground, we need to work with member states as African Union, not only at the planning stage, but we need to evaluate its execution. For instance, we just completed the first 10 years from 2063, and we are starting the second 10-year plan. So when we evaluate the performance of the first 10-year plan, we learned that there is a lot of things that we need to do and a lot of things that we need to improve. So to be able to adjust and to make a difference on the ground, we are engaging with member states, particularly with the planning departments. And it's not going to be only the executive wing. Now we're learning that we need to work with the legislative wing of our member states as well. Because the grand policies and frameworks that we have at continental level, it has to be domesticated and it has to be adopted by our respective member states. And that's going to create the harmony in the laws and regulations that we have among us different member states, where we can create the base and the fertile ground for big initiatives like AfCFTA and others that we have in the continent. So working with the executive and legislative wings of our member states is one of the very basic things that we need to do. And we are shifting towards that in the second decade of Agenda 2063.
I'll come back to that a bit. At the World Economic Forum where you sit right now, how are you seeing the Africa Free Trade Agreement come to life, right? You're the private sector partner for the Africa Free Trade Agreement. What is the African private sector speaking about right now? How is it coming? How are the conversation between private sector and government going along?
Yeah, so thank you for this question. What's really unique about the World Economic Forum as the Forum Friends of the AfCFTA is that we convene over 60 partners of global private sector, the Big 500. We sit in a private room every year and we discuss how do we operationalize this, but not the aspirational angle of it, what is actually being delivered. So every year there's a commitment that is being made, and at the end of that year, or the beginning of that year rather, in Davos, we sit down and we debrief on the private sector presents to the government in that room of this is what I accomplished, these are the bottlenecks, this is what needs to happen. So a more concrete example, we worked and convened and started the workshop process with Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola, within 6 months to 9 months, was able to operationalize the mango agro processing in Kenya, and they were able to increase mango processing domestically by 15% within that first year. And that's just the first year. So now only imagine if we continue to scale this at the level that it's going right now. This year, our focus was on digitalization because we talked a lot about infrastructure, and we understand that you cannot have an intercontinental trade without being able to have a more centralized system of understanding. If I am in Tanzania and I want to purchase shea butter from Ghana, what is the easiest way for me to first find local businesses? Is there a database for that? And if there is, what is the trade processing? So the World Economic Forum actually has these e-trade initiative with our trade center that works directly with these governments in developing these, building into what the Secretariat in Accra is doing. And these are the non-glamorous work that is happening behind closed doors. They're not necessarily always being shown in the way that they should, but we believe in building that momentum. And under 2 decades, within 17 years, we'll be able to accomplish $650 billion added to Africa's economy.
Abir mentioned Kenya, she mentioned Ghana, and these are the rising stars within the continent, right? Not all states are created equal, right? But for Pan-African projects to happen, we need to ensure that all the countries are adjacent to each other when we speak about the growth that is needed, just in order for us to ensure that the governance structures are the same. If you're going in and speaking to a lot of these countries, what is the AU Peace Fund doing to ensure that that is happening?
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting question. So the role of the African Union Peace Fund is to make sure that we have the necessary financial mechanism that's going to help us to prevent conflicts from happening as much as possible. And if they happen, to manage them at the early state. And just to give you background knowledge about the AU Peace Fund, it was established back in 1993, but it was not fully revitalized and operational until 2018. And it was in 2018 that our heads of state and government decided to revitalize the AU Peace Fund following the adoption of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. And after adopting Agenda 2063, they started to question the systems and the frameworks that we have on board, whether they are able to help us to see the Africa we want, or we need to do something about them. And it was at this particular instance, they decided to revitalize the Peace Fund and to give it a different governance structure that it has now. From 1993 until 2018, it was possible to mobilize only 25 million. But in 2018, they said that at least we need to have 400 million to begin with, which is going to help us to intervene when we see challenge in the continent. And after they made that decision, recently, we managed to reach to that 400 million target.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yes. And it took us close to 15 years to reach to 25 million. And look at where we are now. So this is the first step that was taken by our member states to have their own financial resources, which is going to help them to have peace and stability in the continent, not conflict management. It is to prevent conflict. Because conflict management is very expensive and capital intensive. And with all the challenges that we have in the continent, even if we acknowledge the path that we have come through, particularly starting from 2018, even now we're saying that reaching to 400 million is not going to be enough, because we have a number of challenges throughout the continent, and we need to intervene by having predictable and sustainable financing. And with this in mind, our heads of states, just 2 years before, they gave guidance to the African Union through the Peace Fund Secretariat to start to reach out to the private sector of our continent, keeping in mind that the issue of peace and stability is not the sole responsibility of government. And of course, government should play the lead role and should do the best thing possible. But private sector has a stake in the peace and stability of the continent, because peace is the prerequisite for them to do their business. If there is no peace and if there is no stability, they will not be in a position to expand their business in the way that they want to. So with this in mind, we started to reach out to the private sector of our continent, to the multilateral financial institutions that we have in the continent. And in 1.5 years time, in addition to the 400 million, we managed to get a commitment of 219 million from multilateral financial institutions, from public enterprises and private sectors of our continent. And they they promised and pledged to deliver that from 3 to 5 years. And in 1 year time, at least 4 of them delivered close to 3.7 million USD.
Are there any, sorry to interrupt, are there any indicators where you're seeing that a conflict is going to happen in the continent and then you come in and kind of prevent that before it happens, right? Like, what are the first signals that you have that you're keeping an eye out on in order for you to make sure that you're then coming in?
That's a perfect question. For the AU is big to identify the root cause of conflict and to identify it at the early stage. So that's why we decided to use and to work with our regional economic communities and regional mechanisms like IGAD, like ECOWAS, SADC, ICAS, and others, because they are very close to the grassroots, to the member states, as opposed to the continental institutions as big as the African Union. So we provide finance to these regional economic communities so that they can work with member states to identify the root cause of conflict and try to work to address it at the early stage. And the Peace Fund has been operational after revitalizing for the last 2 years. And in 2 years and half time, maximum, we disbursed 39 million USD from the Peace Fund to support member states and as well as regional economic communities. And with that, we are looking forward to see the impact because we have a very unique kind of governance structure at the AU Peace Fund. We have board of trustees representing the 5 regions and our international partners like EU and UN. We also have what we call the Independent Evaluation Group, which is an independent group which is going to evaluate the impact of the disbursement that we made from the AU Peace Fund. And they have a complete and full mandate of publishing their own independent report, even without taking any input from any organ of the governance structure and from the AU in general.
So by supporting these regional blocks, then you're able to kind of empower them in order for them to be able to go and do the research on what might be actually happening.
Absolutely.
At the World Economic Forum level, are you approaching digitization in the continent also in the regional hubs? Or are you looking at it as a Pan-African conversation? And if you're looking at it at a regional conversation level, what countries have you seen that have done it and implemented it very successfully? And like, what lessons can other countries learn from these kind of case studies?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we work directly with the AFCFTA Secretariat. We are a convening institution, so we bring in different multinational, multilateral approach, and we believe that's what the continent also is asking us to do. When it comes to digitalization, it's happening directly within the institutions because you cannot fragment a continent that is essentially trying to build, and this is the approach that the Africa Agenda has. The AFCFTA then, through the mandate that they have, we are working on regional blocks. So the agro-processing or the mango hub that we are supporting to convene and accelerate with our partners. This is happening in Kenya, and now it's expanding into regional Uganda, Tanzania, et cetera. And with the digitalization, then we are also working with Circle and other partners that are coming in who are African partners, not international, which also it's important because, to your point, when you have local institutions and local private sector who are taking ownership of the continent, this is their bottom line. This is their future employers, the future generation, this is their future consumers, so they have more to lose than anyone else, probably even more than the government, to be honest. So this is the approach that we have to all of our work. We work directly with governments, but also ensuring that the private sector is deeply plugged in, whether it's a telecom sector, whether it's the local governance, local institutions, global hubs, young global leaders. You need the young demographic also who are operationalizing this in a way that the government might not be able to do at the level that young people are doing. So this is kind of the multi approach that we look at.
Do you have an example of a country that's doing very well when it comes to the digitization agenda?
There are individual cases, not necessarily through the forum,
Okay.
but we do have the Center for Fourth Industrial Revolution. We have a center in Rwanda. Rwanda is doing an incredible job with the work that they're doing, which is around data production and also wanting to position itself as a global hub. So this is no longer an African regional story. This is Africa positioning itself to the world. So Rwanda does a great job with that. We are having a CEO roundtable that our global partners are coming to Egypt sometime this year, and this is going to be the first time that we have a convening at the global level in regional Africa, where they're not only discussing Egyptian priorities, but also regional priorities. So these are the cases that we're looking at, but the idea is that we can replicate this across the continent within the blocks, that is not just a exceptionalist story, but it's an Africa-wide story.
There is this whole conversation that's going on with regards to AI and how AI is going to wipe off a lot of jobs, right? In a lot of African countries, we see populations growing. And this actually is a threat. AI then is a threat to a lot of these countries. Are there conversations happening with regards to kind of mitigation or preparedness to prepare some of these nations in order for us to make sure that we're ready for that? And then what kind of leadership are we seeing is needed in the continent in the digital age, right? Because what it needs to kind of govern and to kind of convene people, want to put policy through in the past 20 years is not going to be the same in the next 20 years. So what are the highlights that you're both seeing?
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Start at the institutional level.
So this is the critical point that we all need to look into. But I strongly believe that we have advantage as Africa because the continent is the continent of the youth. And the young population is very prone and very close to these technologies. And what we need to do is that we need to provide them with the necessary skills and with the necessary capabilities that they need to own so that they can go through this particular challenge and help us to address and mitigate those upcoming unprecedented maybe consequences that we may face through this thing. So there is ample opportunity for us, but we must be able to do number of preparations ahead of time, including at policy level, at country level, and domesticating it to the respective particular situations that we're going to be in, beyond putting a continental kind of framework. This is how I see it.
Yeah.
So I see it in two ways. I see it as a double-edged sword. In one way, when you sit down with government and ministries of ICT who are working with this,
Are they aware of
They're
the
aware.
speed of how things are moving?
they're aware, but it's interesting because they're actually not as concerned as you think because they don't believe AI needs to be an Africa thing.
Okay.
Africa doesn't need to adopt it. It doesn't need to jump on it. It's not necessarily the same framework that is working in Europe or the US that's going to work for Africa. So a lot of them actually don't see AI as a solution to Africa's progression. On the other side, what I see is these incredible emerging young people who are leveraging AI in a way that is very African, and I don't think we talk about that enough. So I know this young guy from, I believe he's from Zimbabwe, and what he did is he developed a platform with AI that he's capturing indigenous African languages that are completely becoming lost and able to record it and make it easier for if I want to, for example, dying languages like Nubian language in Sudan or dying languages in Nigeria, he's capturing all of that into the system and makes it easier for you then to access it in a way that hasn't been done before. So that's how I see AI really advancing the continent. But in a way that we're talking about AI right now, there's definitely very mixed approaches that I'm seeing across the continent where some are very pro and others are not seeing it as the right solution.
Yeah, but my fear here is that AI and like data and data protection is the central conversation that's happening globally. And if we're saying that it's not for us, then we miss sitting on that table again, and then we're going to be playing catch up at a.
So just to correct that, it's not that we are saying it's not something for us. It's more saying that we don't need to accelerate the industrial revolution of AI as much as other regions, because we are a thriving, growing population. We've talked about this throughout the day. By 2030, you're looking at the largest youth population in the world. This is exceeding China, exceeding India. AI, what it's doing, it's almost replacing or automizing for societies or communities or nations that are aging populations, and they're missing on that working force. So Africa doesn't necessarily need to automize everything right now, because you already have a thriving young population, and that's a dividend that we've been speaking about today. However, a dividend that is not invested in, no one is investing in, that just becomes a lost opportunity. And I think that's what governments I'm speaking with across the continent see that is the opportunity of investing in young people, not necessarily automizing all industries the way that other regions might be doing.
Well, I mean, we spoke at the AU World Economic Forum kind of level. We spoke about what's happening in the continent. I want to switch it up and speak about personally, right? Digmawet, you're a Minister of Transportation in Ethiopia, and then now you're at the AU. What are you doing to ensure that you're building a leadership pipeline in the organizations that you're working in to ensure that the work that you've done does not go when you go, but you've actually left the foundation for what comes next?
Thank you. I was minister before joining the AU. Well, I believe the best thing that we could do when we get a chance to serve the country or institutions as big as the African Union and so, is to make sure that we have the right system in place. We need to make sure that we have the right policies, the right strategies, the proclamations at country level, which is going to help us to implement the policies, the directives, and as well as the rules. They need to come on board. And I'm really glad, and I'm very much thankful that I get a chance to develop the countries. I'm from Ethiopia. Ethiopia's first ever transport policy. We know that we have Ethiopian Airlines. We know that we have railway for 100 years. And we know that the road infrastructure and system has been there for more than a century. But there was no right policy that's going to guide us where we want to be, considering where we are at that particular instance. So we were able to get a chance to ratify that policy, and we were able to work on 30 years master plan, and a 20-year strategy, and a 10-year perspective plan, a number of proclamations and regulations, and of course, rules as well. So after making sure that we have all these policy frameworks, that's the moment I said, I no longer have to be here. I have to move on and start to serve the continent. So after getting a chance to serve at the AU Peace Fund, what we did over the past 3 years was, of course, I'm the very first and establishing director for the Peace Fund after it was revitalized. We developed resource mobilization strategy, which is going to help us on how we can raise resources from the private sector for the coming 5 years. We have modalities on the utilization and implementation of the Peace Fund. We have standard procedures. We have strategies, communication strategies, and others. So I believe wherever we get a chance to lead, what we need to focus on is to work on strategic policy documents so that the person who's going to come and replace us is not going to start from scratch. And you will be in a position to see continuous growth rather than starting afresh after losing time. So that is what I believe in. And what
My clock is red. One last question, Tabir,
Yeah.
before I get kicked out of the stage. Do you think young people should be looking to inherit institutions, or should we be building parallel institutions into the future? I mean, you said at the think tank for the future. What does that look like?
Well, I think both, and you're a great example of that. You've founded Savannah Innovation Labs in Sudan, and you're also continuing your work at this level here in Oxford. You need to inherit institutions, but also understand how this generation is no longer waiting or willing to wait for these reforms to happen, and being able to operate in and outside of institutions the way that you have done so well over your 20 years of incredible work, both within government and outside institutions and inside institutions. I really do believe this is the model. Replacing one with another is not an issue, but I do want to add something, and I know we're out of time. We talk a lot about progress in Africa's development, and we were speaking about this earlier, is that I don't like to use that framing, Africa's development, because what it does is that it almost implies that Africa is starting from zero and that there was nothing, there were no institutions, no knowledge systems. But that's contrary to the 320,000 years of innovation that sits within the continent. 95% of human history happened in Africa. And when you look at the longest trade routes in the world, that was in Africa. When you look at some of the earliest surgeries and medical practices, that was in Africa. We had institutions, we had knowledge systems, and it's not a matter of creating or developing, it's about recovering what was interrupted and what was disrupted through the decades and the years of what happened to the continent. And I would say maybe that is how I frame the work that I do, is not necessarily thinking so far ahead, forgetting that there is a foundation that we need to recover to be able to move forward.
Let's build on the foundation that we have. Dagmawet, Amos Saganalo, Abir, Shukran. Thank you, everyone. Let's join them.